Hello viewers, and welcome to the latest installment of the LOTR LCG progression series. My name is Mitch, and I am the 10th Nazgul. Joining me as always is Matthew, if you'd like to say hello.
Greetings, everyone.
Tonight, we're going to be taking a look at the new hero and player cards of the Black Riders Saga Expansion, the first of an eventual 6 Saga Expansions to retell the entire events of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So, Matthew, why don't you start us off?
So our first Hobbit hero is none other than Sam Gamgee. He has a threat cost of 8, a whopping 3 willpower, 1 attack strength, 1 defense strength, 3 hit points. He is, of course, a Hobbit. And Sam's response reads, after you engage an enemy with a higher engagement cost than your threat, ready Sam Gamgee. He gets +1 willpower, +1 attack strength, and +1 defense strength until the end of the round. So certainly amongst all of our Hobbit heroes, he has the best willpower. I think perhaps the best thing about Sam, and this was recently clarified in our FAQ, is that his abilities stack. So if you engage 2 enemies or 3 enemies with a higher engagement cost than your threat, then Sam's getting +2 or 3 to all of his stats, and that's just absolutely fantastic. There are certainly some interesting cards that we'll be talking about later in this video that can help ensure that enemies have higher engagement costs, but I think Sam is a good contender for perhaps the best Hobbit hero in this Saga expansion.
Almost all of the player cards introduced in the Black Riders Saga Expansion synergize extraordinarily well with one another. In Heirs of Numenor, we saw the Gondor trait developed, and in Khazad-dûm we saw the Dwarf trait, but neither of those had anything close to the level of powerfully synergistic effects that the Hobbits receive. You mentioned that Sam has exceptionally high willpower, the highest willpower of any Hobbit character, but he's actually tied for any leadership hero, tied with Thorin Oakenshield for the highest willpower value. He reminds me of Aragorn and Prince Imrahil in that he's yet another leadership hero with a readying effect, but you get a significant threat savings, and provided that you can trigger his response, his statistics actually end up being pretty powerful. I think he's extraordinarily versatile in not only is he a strong quester, but if it just so happens that you're using willpower for attacking, like in the Stone of Eric scenario or the final quest phase of the Druidan Forest, he hits extraordinarily hard, he's got respectable attack strength in any case, and for defense, he's certainly no slouch. Throughout this expansion, we're going to see that not only do hobbits bolster the engagement cost of enemies, but they keep their threat extraordinarily low. And even though a lot of these hobbits don't start off too terribly powerful in and of themselves, those low threat values and high engagement costs certainly give you a lot of time to dig through your deck for the allies and attachments necessary to build these into absolute powerhouses.
One of the other things that I really like about Sam is that he has 3 hit points. A lot of Hobbit heroes and characters only have 2 hit points, and so because he has a nice pool of hit points that could certainly be boosted by other cards in this expansion, because he also gets a defense boost if you engage with enemies with a higher engagement cost, he could be defending for 2 or 3, perhaps maybe even more, though that could be dangerous, but he has a nice pool of hit points to sort of either absorb treacheries like the Necromancer's Reach, or just be a little bit safer if he's having to defend against some of these enemies. And so, in many ways, I think he's one of the hardiest defenders that a Hobbit deck can have.
Definitely, even if you're playing a Journey to Rosgobel, whether it's the standard or Nightmare difficulty version, he's one of the only Hobbit characters that can survive the reveal of an exhaustion. Before all of our Hobbit heroes were spoiled in a preview article, I was expecting something approximating Wandering Took or Bilbo Baggins, and Sam absolutely blows that out of the water, and as we'll discuss shortly, I think all of the heroes introduced in this Saga expansion are respectably powerful in their own right. Even though he's not the sturdiest defender to start, just like you mentioned, we've got boots from Erebor, we've got ringmail, As I'm sure is going to come up time and time again in this video, we're going to be mentioning many other cards that synergize perfectly with Sam in an offensive or defensive capacity, but keep in mind he's a Hobbit, so Fast Hitch is an option if you want him not only questing, not only defending, but also attacking, and if you've got excess Dunedain warnings. Seeing as how he's a leadership hero, that's also a perfectly respectable choice to boost up his defense strength. When I first saw Sam unveiled, I have to say I was very impressed, and now that he's been out for months, as the community has discussed him, as I've seen him in action, I've only been more and more impressed as time has gone on. Keeping in mind that hobbits do have very low starting threat values, it's important that throughout this video, you keep in mind that they're going to be very secrecy friendly. Particularly important because as we've started to see spoiler articles released for not only The Voice of Isengard, but also the Ringmaker cycle of adventure packs, that keyword is going to be making a comeback in hopefully what ends up to be a very big way. So if it just so happens you start off at 20 or lower threat, if it just so happens that you've got cards in your deck to decrease your threat even more, keep in mind that the secrecy cards relevant to leadership are the powerful event Timely Aid, the ally Dunedain Wanderer, and of course, the neutral attachment Resourceful. But as if Sam was not powerful enough, our next hero of the tactics sphere is Merry, with a threat cost of 6, 2 willpower, 0 attack, 1 defense strength, and 2 hit points. It's yet another Hobbit hero, and reads, Merry gets +1 attack for each Hobbit hero you control. Response: after Merry participates in an attack that destroys an enemy, ready another character that participated in that attack. So we're going to be covering him in depth closer to the end of this video, but in the Black Riders we see a brand new version of Frodo Baggins, belonging to something called the Fellowship Sphere. And just like the Bilbo Baggins of the Hobbit Saga Expansions, he always remains under the control of the first player. So provided that you're running a Hobbit deck, if you've got control of Frodo from the Fellowship Sphere, it's possible that for a mere threat cost of 6, you can have an incredible 4 attack strength Hobbit hero starting the game under your control.
Yeah, Merry is certainly a fantastic hero. Interestingly, I have yet to make a Hobbit deck. I've certainly seen them in action. Ian from Tales from the Cards used one at Gen Con, and it was a pretty good deck, very solid. I have used Merry in non-Hobbit decks. As listeners and viewers of our progression series know, I love tactics, and so oftentimes tactics is at a disadvantage because the starting threat is so high. And so lately I've sort of been experimenting with Bjorn hero, Legolas, and Merry decks. In large measure because Merry has 2 willpower, and that's quite nice for a tactics deck, but also his 6th threat is so low, it can offset higher characters or heroes like Bjorn. And I have to say it's worked out quite well. I don't need his attack strength because tactics can get it in other ways, but I certainly appreciate the lower threat. I haven't used his response too often in my own personal decks because again he's really there just as a low starting threat tactics hero, but I will say I've gotten a little bit of use out of it from time to time, and it can be quite handy. And certainly I think in some ways, Merry resurrects one of my favorite heroes, if only because I root for an underdog, and that would be Brand, Son of Bane. If they're attacking together, they can be readying heroes across the table left and right, and I think it's a very interesting combo that I would love to try out someday. I actually haven't done so, but certainly I've seen some community folks say they've at least thought about it or tried it, and it's potentially quite powerful. I think what I don't like about Merry, and this is true of most hobbits, is they are so squishy. If Merry is committed to the quest for whatever reason, you get 1 or 2 Necromancer's Reaches, and he's dead. And so it is sometimes risky to send these hobbit characters to the quest if they don't have some sort of hit point boosting effect, of which there are a few, some of which we'll talk about in this video. But I think he's a solid hero, whether he's a hobbit deck or a non-hobbit deck.
I definitely have to agree that he is extraordinarily fragile, just as you and I saw in my comeback video. As soon as he had a single point of damage on him, committing him to the quest every round, at least for me, was very anxiety-inducing. But expanding a little bit on some of the points that you brought up when you mentioned Bran, Son of Bane, what I think is so particularly powerful about that combo is, provided that the Hobbit player is running 3 Hobbit heroes, where Merry has 3 attack strength and Brand has 3 attack strength. If those heroes are controlled by opposite players, so long as the Hobbit deck is the one engaging enemies, if those 2 characters attack together, for every enemy they kill, Merry can ready Brand, and Brand can ready Merry. So if you're bolstering up Merry's attack strength, whether it's something like Unseen Strike, or an attachment that we'll be covering a little bit later in this video, both of which cards take advantage of these hobbits having very low threat value compared to the enemy engagement cost, you can get some pretty decent attack strength on the table. And so long as you can keep your defenses up, that powerful combination can literally let you kill an infinite number of enemies. Really, one of the only things holding Merry back, if you consider it that, is that we don't have 3 tactics hobbits, and in fact, if you want to play a hobbit deck, you're either splashing in tactics or you're running a 3-sphere deck. So certainly a lot of the Hobbit cards we see are cheap, a lot of them are extremely powerful, almost all of them provide excellent value for what you're paying for them, and I can't help but think these 2 heroes we've covered so far are just incredible. Provided you are playing 3 hobbits, Merry's not only a saving of 2 points of threat with that base 3 attack value, but keeping in mind we record these card reviews chronologically, he's tied for the highest willpower value of any tactics hero, yet he costs an incredible 4 threat less than the next lowest hero with 2 points of willpower. So all in all, Merry's an extraordinarily potent attacker. Even if you're just splashing tactics into your deck, he gives you access to a lot of cheap, very affordable cards, and I just think that this hero is incredible, Hobbit deck or otherwise. And, again, like all of these heroes, extraordinarily secrecy-friendly.
Up next is the Spirit Hobbit hero, Fatty Bolger. He has a threat cost of 7, 1 willpower, 1 attack strength, 2 defense strength, and 3 hit points. He is, of course, a Hobbit, and his action reads, exhaust Fatty Bolger to choose an enemy in the staging area and raise your threat by that enemy's threat. Until the end of the phase, that enemy does not contribute its threat, and that's limited to once per round. So my first thought here is that he has nice defense and nice hit points for a Hobbit, similar to Sam, but actually slightly better, not taking into account that Sam's could be boosted with his response. This was the one hero that wasn't spoiled by an FFG article, so we players in the community were all wondering who will the 4th Hobbit hero be. A lot of people did correctly guess Fatty Bolger, but I think the community response in large measure has been sort of lukewarm. I think Fatty ranks at the bottom of these 4 Hobbit heroes. A lot of people are quite disappointed. They find his ability counterintuitive to the low starting threat because you have to raise your threat. I have to admit, I've never seen Fatty in action. I haven't used him. I can certainly see value to a degree. He is, in a way, a kind of built-in permanent Radagast's Cunning. Although, for Radagast's Cunning, you don't have to raise your threat. For Fatty, you do. So, in a way, I can see that being valuable. If you need to make a final quest push to get through a quest card, or maybe even to win the quest, certainly raising your threat to get out of a nasty quest card or to end the game is perhaps a no-brainer, and this is a permanent way to do so. You don't have to have Radagast Cunning in your hand. But outside of situations like that where you just absolutely need to get through the quest card, or, everyone's going to be raising their threat, or, you'd be raising it anyway, so why not do it this way? I'm not so sure that I'm keen on this particular Hobbit hero.
Well, we certainly started strong with covering some power cards, and now I suppose we should rein it in a little bit. I'm definitely not that big of a fan of Fatty Bolger. He's certainly a little bit better of a siege quester than Sam, but apart from that, I'm not sure he does much better. Just like you said, there's a pretty hard cap on his defense strength without any sort of attachments loaded up on him. For what his stats are, even though they meet his threat cost, he's starting to feel a little bit expensive. For questing, he's pretty marginal. He's only committing a single point of willpower, and I absolutely loathe when characters have an action that requires them to be exhausted. So it's great if you're holding him back to do a little bit of defending for you, and then you can trigger this ability, but just like you mentioned, it's fairly counterintuitive. Even though the Hobbits have access to a lot of different cards that boost up an enemy's engagement cost, it still seems strange to bolster up your threat like that. He's hardly doing any damage offensively, and defensively, I just can't help but find him pretty underwhelming. I think it's great in an emergency if you really need to drop an enemy's threat, but it just seems like an awfully steep price to pay when this hero otherwise has such limited utility.
Right, you certainly could use him in a mono-spirit deck, Fatty, Frodo, and Pippin from the Against the Shadow cycle, although with Fatty and the Spirit Pippin's abilities, your threat would just be skyrocketing left and right, and even with Frodo, so it's almost counterintuitive. Now certainly the Spirit Sphere, all the four spheres, has the best threat reduction in the game, but I'm not so sure that those would be a trio of hobbits that would win most quests consistently. So yeah, he's a puzzling hero in many ways. Again, it's nice that it's a built-in sort of emergency situation, but as I've said time and time again here in the Progression series and certainly on the Great Company podcast, I am much more of a proactive player. I'm not a big fan of reactive cards. I'd rather be including enough willpower in my deck that I don't need to have to exhaust a hero, which means he's not committed to the quest. He's just sort of sitting there waiting for you to use him, as you mentioned, Mitch, or waiting for the situation to come up that you might have to use him. That's just far too reactive for my tastes. That to me means you're losing, as opposed to aggressively pushing yourself forward through the quest, again, in a proactive way. So unless I get the inkling to try a mono-spirit Hobbit deck or something, I just don't see Fatty ever earning a spot in my decks.
I definitely agree. I can't help but think if you're running this character, he's probably going to be acting as your defender, and if you have to react to something coming off the encounter deck by triggering his ability, that might set you up to be in a pretty nasty situation where you're either taking an undefended attack, or you're losing allies that, at least for these weak little hobbits, might end up being pretty valuable. So he's certainly my least favorite of these four different Hobbit characters. I can't help but think of something the likes of Spirit Glorfindel and just question why anybody would even consider running Fatty. I will mention that the secrecy cards associated with Spirit are Out of Sight, where you prevent enemy attacks, and O Elbereth Gilthoniel, where you place enemies on the bottom of the encounter deck. But running a hero like Fatty, you cannot reasonably expect to keep yourself at or below that secrecy threshold for long.
To perhaps end our Fatty discussion on a more positive note, I will say that I really enjoy his art. It's quite a different style. I almost want to call it cartoonish, but it's not quite cartoonish, but it's quite different than our other Hobbit heroes, and I like it. I think it's very interesting. It's sort of an action-y pose. He's out there looking for threat to help guard the hobbits against an enemy or something. I don't know. It's cool, but sadly, I don't build my decks based on art, so I don't, again, think that Fatty will ever be in my hero lineup.
You know, while you were busy being positive about Fatty, I thought of one more negative thing to mention about him.
Of course you did.
And that's that I can't help but feel that sometimes in certain scenarios you're really riding the line as to whether or not enemies are going to be engaging with you, and unless you've got a lot of the cute Hobbit effects to rely on where you can push up their engagement cost, enemies like Goblin Spearmen, Goblin Swordsmen are probably going to be engaging with you pretty quickly, and I just can't help but see a rather weak defending character like this one getting pretty quickly overwhelmed. But moving back to greener pastures, next up is Pippin, the lore Hobbit hero, with a threat cost of 6, 2 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense value, and 2 hit points. He reads, each enemy in play gets +1 engagement cost for each Hobbit hero you control, and response. After you engage an enemy with an engagement cost higher than your threat, draw a card. So, he's certainly a terrible defender on par with our Tactics Hobbit hero, but for that very low threat value, he's a pretty stellar quest contributor. He is fairly fragile when it comes to the reveal of treacheries during the staging step. He's not doing much in the way of attacking, but like so many other lore cards, he's an absolutely stellar source of card advantage.
Yeah, I think Pippin is fantastic, and one of the drawbacks, if you could call it that, is that he came out so soon after the Spirit version in the Against the Shadow cycle that the poor Spirit version was quickly overshadowed by his lore cousin. With that said, certainly the card draw is nice, though as a non-lore player in general, I prefer his passive ability, which is enemies getting +1 engagement cost. One thing, it's easy to forget that when you're playing games. I feel like I forget it often, but even if he's the only Hobbit hero on the board, having an extra turn for a Hill Troll, for example, going from 30 threat to 31, while that doesn't sound like a lot, it can be quite helpful to give you one more planning phase to get out a few more allies or attachments or armors or what have you to help you deal with that beefy enemy or any other. This is one of the few ways in the game to actually increase the engagement cost of enemies, and it's a welcome addition. I think it's very interesting, I think it's very thematic, and it certainly is very helpful. Again, just like Mary, even outside of a full-on 3 Hobbit hero deck.
Looking at the lore version of Pippin, I can't help but feel like this game has changed quite a bit since the days of the core set and the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle. Compared to our classic version of Bilbo Baggins, not only is Pippin questing harder, but he can draw you more cards faster and his threat cost is far lower. Even though they both are a natural sphere match for Burning Brand, I can't really see players putting that on Pippin, but apart from that, he really pulls ahead of Bilbo, who certainly doesn't have anything resembling this powerful passive ability. Just like I mentioned for our previous hero, often we find ourselves riding the line. Your example during Journey Along the Anduin was perfect, where sometimes buying yourself an extra few rounds, again, to get additional attachments, to get additional allies, is going to make all the difference, just because this game can be so incredibly brutal during those first few rounds before the players get a chance to establish themselves. Just like when we covered Sam Gamgee, keep in mind there's no limit to the number of times that this response can trigger, so if you're running something crazy like Hammer Stroke, if, since he's a lore character, you're taking advantage of Fast Hitch to give yourself the ability to deal with a lot of enemies engaging with you, you could be drawing a simply absurd amount of cards. And lore itself has so much built-in card draw, I can't help but feel like not only is the Hobbit deck very powerful on its own 2 feet, but it can also be a fantastic source of support for all the other players. Particularly because the Black Riders expansion introduces so many powerful, cheap different cards, and all of these heroes, save Fatty Bolger, are so powerfully synergistic, it just makes for an incredibly rich, rewarding tri-sphere experience. where you don't so much feel held back or strapped for resources, but like you've got access to a plethora of different effects. So all in all, with only one exception, I think these Hobbit heroes are fantastic, and I cannot wait to try out a Hobbit deck in our series. But before we move on to cover the remainder of our player cards, again, because Pippin is a hero with such an incredibly low starting threat value, I'll just mention that the lore secrecy cards are needful to know to potentially drop your threat even further, out of the wild to remove exceptionally dangerous cards from the encounter deck and risk some light, which allows players to take a peek at and somewhat rearrange the encounter deck in the order of their choice.
Well, now that we've covered our 4 heroes, it's on to the leadership cards. The first of which is the ally, Bill the Pony. Bill costs 2. He has 1 willpower, 1 attack strength, 0 defense strength, and 2 hit points. Bill is both a creature and a pony. He cannot have attachments, and you get to lower the cost to play Bill the Pony by 2 if you control Sam Gamgee. Each Hobbit character gets +1 hit point. So certainly this is an auto-include if you're running a Hobbit deck, whether I think Sam is there or not. Certainly if you're playing with Sam Gamgee, Bill the Pony is free, and it makes those oh-so-squishy Hobbits just slightly less squishy. I think it's so fun to have this character from the books being an ally. I've seen Bill the Pony participate in attacks from time to time, and I just always find that quite amusing. And then certainly, because I've been playing quests that include this card, Confidant the Carrick, lately, he certainly could help with a frightened beast. You could discard Little Bill the Pony. That might be a little painful because your Hobbit heroes become more vulnerable, but certainly we have so few creatures in the game that Bill is a response to that nasty, nasty treachery.
It certainly seems a little bit silly at first to get this very interesting character from the novels. It's literally a pony that the Fellowship had under their care for a brief period of time, but in practice, I can't help but think this is an extraordinarily useful, flexible, and powerful character. If you're running a Hobbit deck, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be running Sam Gamgee, and putting a character like this into play for free is pretty potent. We've seen a host of different effects that reward players based on the number of allies they control alone, so not only can he provide a chump blocking service for absolutely no cost, but if you're benefiting from the likes of Faramir or something like Sword That Was Broken, he can actually contribute a pretty reasonable willpower value. He's got multiple hit points, so he's not immediately being killed by Dark and Dreadful or the Necromancer's Reach, and just like you mentioned, he can contribute to attacks as well. I think what's most amazing about this card is that it's a sterling example of power creep within this game. So back in Khazad-dûm, we saw the attachment Boots of Erebor, which gives either a dwarf or a hobbit +1 hit point, but for a cost of 0. Not only does this give every Hobbit character, so not only those you control, but every single Hobbit character on the entire table +1 hit point, but it also serves the multitude of different functions I already mentioned. So it's unique, it can't have attachments, but certainly you can play multiple copies of this. If you've got effects that take advantage of characters leaving play, like Horn of Gondor, it becomes better than free. If you've got a Gondor player running Prince Imrahil and Valiant Sacrifice, this is another fantastic opportunity to really benefit from allies being discarded. So, in summation, he might at first seem like a silly card, but overall, Bill the Pony is a powerhouse of a creature. So, yet another way of bolstering the defensive value of some of our Hobbit characters is the leadership attachment Hobbit Cloak. With a cost of 1, it is trait item, and reads attached to a Hobbit hero, limit 1 per hero. Attached hero gets +2 defense strength while defending against an attack by an enemy with an engagement cost higher than your threat. So, naturally, this goes fantastically well paired with Sam Gamgee, so not only is he committed to the quest, you pull down an enemy optionally to your side of the table, Sam readies, he gets that +1 defense strength bonus, and once you're defending with Hobbit Cloak, he gets an additional 2, putting him at a base of 4, on par with the likes of an unbuffed Baragond.
Right, I don't have much to say about this attachment. I think it's relatively straightforward, and I think it's an auto-include. As you mentioned, it's certainly great for Sam. Could even be good on Fatty Bolger if you're using him in your deck at all and using him in a defensive capacity. The only other thing I can think of is certainly you can get more use out of the Hobbit Cloak by using something like Fast Hitch, the Hobbit Redding effect, to get even more beefed up defense out of your Hobbit Defender.
It's certainly a shame that this is only limit 1 per hero, but for the same cost as a Dunedain Warning, it's got a more potent effect. It certainly is possible that you might run into situations where enemies' engagement costs are higher than your threat value, but by all means, research your scenarios. If you know that you're frequently going to be encountering enemies with extraordinarily low engagement costs, then opt for a different card, but in almost all situations, I think this is going to be a fantastic value, no matter which Hobbit Defender you end up sticking it on. So we've covered some effects that boost enemy engagement cost, we still have a few left to go, so this is yet another powerful piece of Hobbit synergy, and I look forward to trying this card and so many more.
So moving on to our tactics cards, the first of which is the ally Farmer Maggot. He costs 3, he has 1 willpower, 2 attack strength, 0 defense strength, 2 hit points, he is unique, he is a Hobbit, and his response reads, after Farmer Maggot enters play, deal 1 damage to an enemy engaged with you. Deal 2 damage instead if that enemy's engagement cost is higher than your threat. So certainly the theme of the Hobbits is starting to come out. Keeping your threat low, keeping enemies' engagements higher than you, gives you a lot of benefit. He's similar to other tactics allies that have sort of a when they enter play they deal damage effects, Descendant of Thorndor for example. Although in this case, the enemy must be engaged with you. His cost is a little hefty, his stats are okay, certainly having 2 attack strength in a Hobbit deck will be nice. Outside of a Hobbit deck, I'm not so sure that he's an ally that I would include very, very often. 1 damage isn't that much. In a traditional tactics deck, most enemies aren't going to be having an engagement cost higher than my own. Again, he's relatively squishy. You're certainly not defending with this character. So I'm not sure that I'm really wanting to pay 3 for a 2 attack strength character, even if he does have 1 willpower, which tactics is always sorely needing.
Even though, in theory, his ability can score you some free kills, I think the trick here is that the enemy does already have to be engaged with you. So if you've got a very low threat value, unlike a somewhat similar card like the ally the Knight of Minas Tirith, you're not able to pick off or affect enemies in the staging area. I do like that this is a response that doesn't require any sort of exhaustion on his part, so in an ideal situation, maybe you've got one player running Thalon, Farmer Maggot drops into play, he picks off one weak enemy, and then ends up contributing to an attack a little bit later in the round, but for the most part, he's awfully expensive for what you get, and I can't help but think you'll rarely find yourself in a situation where you're going to really significantly mathematically benefit from his ability. So even though 2 damage can help, is it really going to make all the difference? Is it going to be 2 damage that you need, or is it just going to be 1 damage? Or do you have sufficient attack strength available to begin with? As with any other direct damage effect, it's certainly nice that it ignores defense, and even though this ability does work well in combination with either the attachment Borne Aloft or the event Sneak Attack, you're really going to see a hell of a lot more benefit from either of those cards with other characters. Considering that you might only be running 1 tactics hero if you're doing the Tri-Sphere Hobbit deck, I don't really see Farmer Maggot being worth the investment. There aren't many ways to conveniently boost up his attack, so, well, you'll certainly find the occasion where you do make pretty good use of his ability, maybe softening up an enemy for a Gondorian Spearman or Spear of the Citadel to pick off. At this point in the game, I really don't see him being worth it. But onto a much more potent card, we have the Tactics attachment Dagger of Westernesse. For a cost of 1, it has the traits Artifact, Item, and Weapon, and reads Attached to a hero, restricted. Attached hero gets +1 attack strength, +2 attack instead if attacking an enemy with an engagement cost higher than your threat. So yet another card that's following that low threat theme. This is one of the only ways in the game of bolstering the attack strength of any character. So it's not restricted to elves like Rivendell Blade, it's not restricted to dwarves like Dwarodelf Axe, and it's cheaper than Dwarven Axe. So this is certainly a very flexible card, and for the same resource investment as a Dunedain Mark, this Tactics card has the ability to give a Hobbit or any other hero a pretty potent attack boost.
Yeah, I absolutely think that this is a great weapon, whether it's on any of our Hobbit heroes like Merry or potentially Sam. I also think it'd be great for our core set classic hero Duneheir. Since Duneheir's often attacking into the staging area, the enemies that are left are most likely going to have an engagement cost higher than your threat, so this is a perfect attachment for him. I've often used this outside of Hobbit decks, largely because of optional engagements. I can choose to optionally engage an enemy with a higher engagement cost than my threat, and therefore I'm getting that automatic +2 attack on whichever character happens to have the dagger. So it really truly is a stellar attachment, in large measure because of its flexibility, like you mentioned. It can go on any hero, but also because there are many, many times in the game where you're attacking enemies with higher engagement costs. So I think it's a stellar weapon, stellar attachment, and really I think any tactics deck can benefit from this ability.
I just can't help but be blown away by not only this powerful attachment, but really how the Hobbit trait ended up being developed as a whole. Going into this first Saga expansion, so many players were expecting cards the likes of Bilbo Baggins from The Hunt for Gollum, or the spirit version of Pippin we saw introduced in the Encounter at Amon Den, but if you're running Merry, if he has 2 daggers, provided you're playing one of the Black Riders scenarios, and you've got 4 Hobbit heroes under your control, a Hobbit hero with a threat cost of 6 is attacking for a potential 8, which just seems incredible. So even though people certainly weren't expecting much, these Hobbit cards thus far just seem incredible. And as I mentioned earlier in this video, it seems that more and more, as the Lord of the Rings living card game develops, we see tighter and tighter synergy, more and more powerful effects, and with each passing expansion, with each mostly weekly preview article, I just can't help but get more and more excited for this incredible game.
So our final tactics card of this expansion is Halfling Determination. It's an event that costs 1, and its action reads, choose a Hobbit character. That character gets +2 willpower, +2 attack, and +2 defense until the end of the phase. Fantastic event. I don't have a ton more to say besides that. I have used this in my decks, in fact the progression series video, that I use Merry not as an attack boost, not as a defense boost, but a way to get extra willpower out of the Hobbit hero that I knew I'd be using every round. And in fact it came in quite helpful. There was a time that we had underquested, sadly, and I was able to bust out Halfling Determination to boost up our willpower by 2. So for the cost of 1 to get that extra willpower, I think is fantastic. Now certainly the attack or the defense would be great. This can go on any Hobbit character, doesn't have to be a hero, but again, if you're running a Hobbit deck, I think this is almost a no-brainer for whichever stat you're wanting to boost.
I definitely like this card, and I really like that this is introduced in the Tactics sphere. It's essentially a Hobbit version of the Dwarven Durin's Song. Like you pointed out, it's very handy for turning a failed quest into breaking even or a success. It's perfect to provide that last point or two to not only overcome some sort of nasty active location, but maybe you're just a couple points shy of killing some nasty enemy, and this single card can make all the difference. Certainly there's nothing preventing players from playing multiple copies of this on the same character. There's nothing preventing you from using records, namely the Book of Eldacar, to recycle this event, and if you're playing Hobbits, chances are you're running multiple spheres and you've got a host of different readying effects to rely on. So maybe you've got Merry killing enemies, where you're able to ready characters to do additional attacks to continue benefiting from this effect. Maybe you've also got that Bran Son of Bane combo working in your favor, so the two of them combined, instead of having a mere 6 or 7 attack, all of a sudden get upwards of 8 or 9, or even more depending on what attachments you have stuck to them. It's a bit of a shame that this is a one-time use effect, but it's perfect for emergencies. It's certainly a very fairly priced effect, and for what it is, I just see it as being yet another powerful addition to the tactics sphere and the Hobbit synergy. But onward to our spirit cards, the first of which is a zero-cost attachment, Hobbit Pipe. It is trait item and pipe and reads attached to a Hobbit, limit 1 per character and response. After your threat is reduced by an event card effect, exhaust Hobbit Pipe to draw a card. So, outside of the lore sphere, we're seeing a fairly powerful, repeatable card draw effect. So, not only are you likely to run threat mitigation effects as spirit, either so you can maintain that secrecy threshold, so you can keep your threat lower than your enemy's engagement costs, but in addition to that, you're going to be getting some bonus card draw. I like that this isn't restricted. You can stick it on Hobbit allies if you'd like, and even though there's no way of readying attachments at this point in the game, each and every turn you can benefit from that pretty powerful effect.
Yeah, I don't have much to say here. In fact, my notes simply read nice effect, and I think that it is. I think most of my comments are sort of on the design of the card. I think it's well designed. I like that it's limit 1 per character. I like that you have to exhaust it. I like that it can only be attached to a Hobbit. So while it is indeed a powerful effect, you can only get 1 card per round because you have to exhaust it, unless of course you have multiple copies of these in play, but you can't load it up all on 1 character. So from a design perspective, I think it's very well done. It sort of prevents being broken or Spirit somehow becoming a better card draw engine than lore. So yeah, it's certainly a nice card that I think could fit quite well into a Hobbit deck.
Yeah, a couple other things I like about this are that it's free, that as soon as you're able to play some threat reduction effect, it effectively replaces itself, because it does have a 0 cost. As soon as you draw another copy, you're able to slap that into play, presuming you've got an eligible character in play. And something I like the most about this is that if any player triggers a global threat reduction effect, like if you happen to play the Gladrim's Greeting, if I ever see the day, if I've got Hobbit Pipes in play, I benefit from your effect. So it's not very often that I play multiple threat reduction cards in the same turn, so I don't feel like that limit is much of a restraint. We've seen effects like Elrond's Council that are auto-includes in many decks, so I see this as starting off very powerful. I think it's probably only going to get better as we see more and more pipe synergy throughout the Lord of the Rings Saga Expansions. And as I've said so many times for our previous cards, I'm very much looking forward to seeing this one in action. Really, the only other thing I can think of to mention for Hobbit Pipe is Spirit players are welcome to take advantage of effects like Dwarven Tomb to return those threat reduction effects to their hand in order to not only benefit once again from dropping their threat, but also to keep feeding this card advantage engine. Certainly Map of Earnil would also be an option if it just so happens that you're running a mono spirit deck, but considering that Frodo, Pippin, and Fatty aren't necessarily the most powerful and synergistic trio of heroes, and that if you're playing our first or second Saga expansion you can't have the spirit version of Frodo in play, I certainly can't see players relying on that kind of effect. As one final thought for Hobbit Pipe, if it just so happens that that spirit player has had a huge influx of cards, maybe they're running our new lore version of Pippin alongside multiple copies of the pipe, keep in mind that if it just so happens that you're running this ally, it could be pretty beneficial to affix this attachment to a wandering toque and transfer control of that character before you trigger an event like Galadrim's Greeting, specifically so you can spread that card advantage around.
So our second and final spirit card of this expansion is a complement to Hobbit Pipe, and that is the 2-cost event Smoke Rings. Its action reads, reduce your threat by 1 for each pipe you control. Each hero with a pipe attachment gets +1 willpower until the end of the phase. I have actually built a deck with Hobbit Pipe and Smoke Rings included. Well, I shouldn't say I built it. It was a Spirit Pippin deck that I tried out thanks to one of the Grey Company podcast listeners submitting that deck. But I have to say the problem that I have with Smoke Rings is very similar to the issues I have with the tactics card Foe Hammer, in which you have to attack an enemy, exhaust a weapon, to then draw some cards. This is the same thing. And when I was playing a deck with Smoke Rings and Hobbit Pipe in it, I had a hand of 3 Smoke Rings by the end of the game, and never once did I draw a Hobbit Pipe. So it was quite frustrating to have 3 dead cards in my hand, no pipes in sight. Certainly I wonder if we'll be getting more pipes in the future to make this card maybe a bit less risky. Certainly I think there's the potential for it to be nice. Reducing your threat then triggers the pipe. Getting the extra willpower is just an extra bonus. But based on my experience with this card, I'm just not a big fan of it. It's somewhat expensive. You have to have another card in play. You may or may not ever draw that card. And so while I certainly appreciate the effect, I think it could be beneficial in some situations. Only having 1 pipe to draw from at this point in the game makes it that much more unlikely that you'll ever have the pair.
There have been a lot of cards that we've covered so far that have been clearly powerful, clear hits, but for me, this one registers as a miss. I can't help but be reminded of the days of the Hunt for Gollum adventure pack, where we saw the Eagles are coming and mustering the Rohirrim, where those cards can be good in theory, but there's just nothing to work with them. That synergy is not yet established. We only have one option for pipe attachments at this point, so just like the experience you related, I think so often you're going to struggle and flounder because you draw one of these cards without the other. Under ideal circumstances, when you play this card, you have 3 copies of Hobbit Pipe in play, and for a cost of 2, you're able to reduce your threat by 3. You also get a boost of 3 willpower, but that's provided that you're contributing every single one of your Hobbit heroes to the quest, which, even though it's likely, it's certainly not always the case. Like if you're running Merry, chances are you're probably having him hang back to attack, unless you've got effects from the Spirit Sphere like Unexpected Courage in play as well. It strikes me as a very expensive card for the effect you see. Something like Elrond's Council drops your threat by 3 for no cost and gives you 1 willpower, so until we start seeing a lot more pipe attachments, just because this is reduce your threat by 1 for each pipe you control, and Hobbit Pipe itself doesn't specify that it has to be attached to a hero, simply a character, it's possible that someday we could see a pretty significant threat reduction and willpower bolstering effect from this card, but at the moment, there's just not enough there to make this worth playing. I can think of nearly innumerable other threat reduction and willpower boosting effects that I would much rather see. But onward to our trio of new lore cards, the first of which is a unique ally, Barliman Butterbur. For a cost of 2, he has 1 willpower, 0 attack, 1 defense, 3 hit points. He's the first character we've seen with the Bree trait, and reads, if each hero you control has the Hobbit trait, damage from undefended attacks against you may be assigned to Barliman Butterbur. So, for a fairly minor cost, you get a relatively hardy ally. He's got a respectable pool of hit points, but not much in the way of defense strength. He does not have the Hobbit trait, so he doesn't have access to a hit point boosting effect like Bill the Pony, but certainly that ability can help in an emergency.
Yeah, in many ways, I think Barliman is like his lore counterpart, Dory. You had mentioned power creep earlier in this video, so not only does Dory cost 1 more resource, although he does have slightly more respectable stats, you have to exhaust Dory to transfer that damage. Barliman, on the other hand, could be committed to the quest. He could have potentially done a defense. In other words, you don't have to exhaust him to trigger his ability, so he's quite powerful. As we mentioned earlier, Hobbits are quite squishy, they die quite easily, and then the Black Riders quests, you're going up against a bunch of nasty, beefy, huge Nazgul. And so there's going to be plenty of times where Sam, even with his Hobbit cloak or what other attachments you might have on him, isn't enough to stomach an attack from the Mitch-King. And Barliman Butterbur is going to be there, willing and able to soak up that attack. So in a Hobbit deck, I think he's absolutely crucial in many ways, because again, Hobbits are so weak that he can sort of play a role in absorbing some extra damage, and you get extra use out of him, whether it's, again, questing or whatnot.
I think it's very important that if you've got a lore Hobbit on the table that you are running Barliman, specifically because in these Saga expansions, from what we've seen so far, you're not able to use the spirit version of Frodo Baggins because you're stuck with our new Fellowship Sphere version. So instead of being able to assign an undefended attack to Frodo and taking that in the form of threat gain instead of a hero being killed, you can simply assign that damage to Barliman. And because the Hobbit deck really promotes dual or tri-sphere decks, it's not very practical to run the similar character, White Tower Watchman, just because it's so unlikely that your heroes are going to belong to the same sphere of influence. And if you happen to be the first player in control of Frodo, then that's thrown out the window immediately. He's certainly far from the most glamorous hero to put into play, but for costing a mere 2 resources, even if you've only got 1 lore hero, it's not that hard to drop him onto the table, and if it just so happens that you find yourself in some sort of crisis or emergency, that ability can be an absolute lifesaver.
Up next is the lore attachment Elfstone. It costs 1, it's an artifact and an item. It must attach to the active location, and the active location gets +1 quest point. The response reads, after the attached location leaves play as an explored location, the first player puts 1 ally into play from his hand. Let me first say that I love the design of this card. There's a minor drawback in that the attached location gets +1 quest point, and then you get a potentially huge reward. In fact, this card might actually be too cheap. Maybe it should cost 2 or actually add more quest points, but the response is just fantastic. So whether you're able to drop a Corset ally Bjorn, or perhaps Gildor and Glorian or Haldir, or any high-cost power ally, Gandalf, of course, would be a great ally to drop into play. Elfstone is just so fantastic. It's very thematic. I think it's a great card. I've seen a lot of my buddies use this card to great effect. If it's not the top card of the expansion, it's certainly, for me, in the top 3.
I think this can be an absolutely incredible source of resource savings outside of the leadership sphere. So instead of generating additional resource tokens for yourself, Provided you can get a location into play, provided it's not immune to player card effects, you can dump one copy at a time of Elfstone into play and potentially put a 5 or 6 cost ally into play for an investment of a mere 1 resource. I certainly think that there are going to be times, just like when Spirit players run Ancient Matham, that in practice this doesn't turn out to be quite as useful as it is in theory, but it's such a powerful effect and has such incredible potential, and as we eventually see more and more expensive cards developed, this is only going to get stronger and stronger, and even though it adds a paltry 1 quest point to the active location, so often I don't think that's going to make any difference, so it's certainly good to be communicating either to yourself or amongst all the different players so that you can make sure that this does get triggered and triggered in a timely fashion so that it's not putting something like a Snowborn Scout into play, or it just so happens that you complete the location when the player with only events or attachments in his hand is first player, so I definitely have to agree with you. I think this card is remarkable. It allows you to even put out-of-sphere cards into play. So if you feel like doing something risky, you're certainly welcome to include cards like Eagles of the Misty Mountains in your deck, if it just so happens that certain cards synergize well with whatever your teammates are running. So the options for this card are limitless. It's extremely powerful. It's very much a card that I would encourage you to play. It's very much a card that we all need to pay close attention to as more and more, particularly lore allies, are released. And I think this is certainly one of the strongest cards of this expansion. So, our final lore event is Take No Notice, with a cost of 3, and reads lower the cost to play Take No Notice by 1 for each Hobbit or Ranger trait hero you control, and action, add 5 to each enemy's engagement cost until the end of the round. So, for any number of different effects, if you're wanting to get additional attack strength from Unseen Strike, if you're wanting to draw additional cards from Pippin, or if you're wanting to make sure that Sam is readied, if it just so happens that you're riding the line in regard to an enemy's engagement cost, you can boost it up, you can optionally engage with them, you can lay down this card and reap all the benefits. Or, if it just so happens that you're not to the point where you feel comfortable dealing with enemies, and you need another round or so to prepare, this event is certainly an option.
Yeah, I like the flexibility that it could certainly fit nicely in a Hobbit deck with all the effects that you mentioned, but it also can fit into a Ranger deck. At this point in the game, there are 6 Ranger heroes, of course 2 of which are Aragorn, but Faramir, he gets +1 attack for each enemy in the staging area. If you're boosting all of their engagement costs by 5, hopefully that will keep a few more of them in the staging area. Faramir's attack is boosted up, whether he's killing enemies engaged with you or somehow has the ability to attack into the staging area, that could be quite nice. So even though Hobbit decks tend to be tri-sphere decks, Leadership Sam, Tactics Mary, and lore Pippin, the nice thing I think about this card is that you do get to lower the cost by 1 for each Hobbit you control, so it's potentially free. Same thing in a Ranger deck. I'm not sure Ranger decks tend to have 3 Ranger heroes at this point. They don't really synergize all that well together, though I suppose you could have the lore version of Aragorn, Barivor, and then Faramir to reduce the cost of this particular event. It's nice. Not my favorite card, but it's certainly not bad either.
This card definitely sparks my interest in seeing what Caleb and Matt intend to do with future effects that help interweave and synergize the Hobbit and Ranger traits. But at the moment, I think one reasonably powerful option might be Poison Stakes that we so recently discussed in the Blood of Gondor player card review video, where one of our complaints was oftentimes when you play that card, you're not going to be able to kill the enemy it ends up attached to at the end of the round, or maybe it just so happens that you're going to have to suffer through multiple attacks from that enemy before the attachment ends up picking it off. So maybe through a take no notice or 2 or even 3, you're able to slowly let the attachment bleed that enemy dry and eventually kill it without your ever having to deal with defending or an attack. Or if it does happen to be a weak enemy, you can leave it sitting in the staging area until the end of the turn, and then it dies without your ever having to encounter it. This certainly doesn't strike me as the most appealing card. I would imagine in most scenarios, particularly for Hobbit decks, your starting threat and threat throughout the game is going to start and stay sufficiently low enough that you're not going to need to rely on an effect like this, but certainly there are specific scenarios where this could be useful, and as we see more and more ranger heroes introduced, this could end up being a pretty powerful effect.
I think my final thought on this is perhaps this is a better card in multiplayer than solo. So for Mitch, you had mentioned that for a Hobbit deck, the threat might be low enough, but in a multiplayer game, whatever your buddy's deck is, might have to tangle with all the enemies because yours is too low or your Hobbit characters are too squishy. So the Hobbit character being able to play this for free could certainly benefit all of the other players in a 2, 3, or 4 player game, and in that sense, I think this card may be much more worthwhile.
I'll definitely agree, and particularly if something comes off the encounter deck that you weren't expecting, or it just so happens that it turns out you overcommitted to questing, this can be a pretty decent corrective effect. So I'm not jumping to include this in my deck by any means, but I suppose, as with any card, I'll certainly reevaluate this over time.
So now that we've covered our standard player cards, we're left with 2 Fellowship Sphere cards. The first of which is a hero version of Frodo Baggins. He has a 0 threat cost, 2 willpower, 1 attack strength, 2 defense strength, 2 hit points. He has both the Hobbit and the Ring Bearer trait, and his response reads, spend 1 Fellowship resource and exhaust the 1 ring to cancel the effect of an encounter card just revealed from the encounter deck. Shuffle that card back into the encounter deck and reveal another encounter card. I don't have a ton to say here, except that I found his response just absolutely crucial in all 3 of the Black Riders quests when I have played them. Having a constant sort of source of cancellation, so to speak, when playing quests is quite nice, so you don't have to depend on having a test of will in your hand or anything else. Now, you do have to spend a fellowship resource, you do have to exhaust the ring, the encounter deck gets nastier if the ring is exhausted, and fellowship resources are often scarce, but it was certainly nice to have Frodo's ability in your back pocket should you not have any other way to cancel encounter card effects.
I definitely can't complain with being given a free hero. Just like in the Saga expansions with Bilbo Baggins, your victory condition is in part contingent upon Frodo Baggins staying in play until the end of the scenario. But certainly he's a reasonable quester, he's even a decent defender, and we've covered a number of different cards that really boost a defending Hobbit into a relatively sturdy character. Things like Hobbit Cloak and Ringmail can make you much more comfortable defending with Frodo, particularly against some of the weaker, non-Nazgul enemies that we'll be seeing in the 3 Black Riders scenarios. So he's certainly relatively fragile. He's not doing much when it comes to offense, but he's certainly got a powerful ability. Being able to replace the 1 encounter card that is going to absolutely demolish you is indescribably powerful. And as I really like to see, you don't have to keep him unexhausted throughout the round just in case you want to trigger his ability. Really, the only other thing I have to say is that nowhere in the rulebook does it specify that you cannot use resource acceleration effects to gather additional Fellowship Sphere resources. So as we're about to see, the Fellowship event we receive in this Saga expansion is very powerful. We've had another powerful Fellowship Sphere attachment spoiled. So, certainly those resources are a valuable commodity, you want to use them sparingly, invest them wisely, and by all means, if you can think of a clever way of saving yourself something like good meal, then I'll certainly encourage you to take advantage of it. The event that I alluded to, also of the Fellowship Sphere, is Frodo's Intuition. At a cost of 2, which reads Action, each hero you control gets +1 willpower until the end of the round. Draw 1 card for each Hobbit hero you control. So, even though these Fellowship Sphere cards are limited to the Black Riders and our subsequent Lord of the Rings trilogy saga expansions, this is a pretty potent effect. Like I mentioned, if you take advantage of Good Meal, it's free to put into play, and even though you might not benefit from every one of your heroes gaining +1 willpower, it does persist to the end of the round, and if you're running a Hobbit deck, that is a serious amount of card draw.
Yeah, I certainly think it's a nice card. And you're right, even though not all of your heroes might be questing, there certainly are the hide tests that require willpower in the Saga expansion. So having ways to boost up your willpower outside of the questing phase are always going to be welcome. It is a hefty cost. I know I definitely have never used it, just like I never used any of the Baggins Sphere cards. I've not seen my buddies use this when we've played the Black Riders, but I certainly can't deny its power. So I think, it's not a bad card. I just tend to save my resources for things like Frodo's ability.
I think you might be much more likely to see this event used in a single-player game, just because as you're revealing fewer encounter cards, I think the odds of you pulling something that's incredibly nasty that you can't deal with, that you need to substitute and swap in for a different encounter card, is all the less likely. So this certainly can be a powerful effect, being able to draw up to 4 cards for 2 resources, so long as you don't need them for other effects, is exceptionally powerful. I think this certainly trumps the 2 Baggins Sphere cards we've previously seen, so it remains to be seen as to whether we try and take advantage of this in a 2-player game, but it certainly has potential, and I'll say again, much more so than those Baggins Sphere cards. So, to bring this video to a close, we have 6 neutral player cards, the Boons introduced in the Black Riders. The way that these work is that provided you're playing campaign mode, once you beat the first scenario of the Black Riders, A Shadow of the Past, the players are given the option of choosing either Gildor Inglorian or Mr. Underhill and adding it to their campaign pool. And when constructing their decks to play any of these scenarios, the players are welcome to choose amongst these Boon cards, in addition to whatever normal player cards they would choose. So taking a look at the first of these, we have Gildor Inglorian, a unique objective ally. He has no casting cost, so he's free to put into play. Just like the lore ally version, he has 3 willpower, 2 attack, 3 defense, and 3 hit points. He's trait Noldor, and the first player gains control of Gildor Inglorian. Forced. At the end of the round, discard Gildor Inglorian. The first player may spend 1 fellowship resource to cancel this effect.
Another Boon card is Mr. Underhill. It's a title, it's permanent. Setup attached to the Ring Bearer. Action. Add Mr. Underhill to the victory display to choose an enemy engaged with you. Until the end of the round, that enemy cannot attack you, and it has 1 victory point.
So, granted that we're given the option to pick between these 2 different boons once we beat the first scenario, which of these is personally more appealing to you?
Well, it's hard to know. I'll fully admit I've never played campaign mode, and I don't think I'm interested in playing campaign mode until all of the 6 Saga expansions are out. Personally, because I want all the heroes at my disposal so I don't have to change every time a new cool hero comes out. With that said, Mr. Underhill is somewhat underwhelming, but to me, Gildor isn't that exciting either. As I mentioned just a moment ago when discussing our new Frodo hero card, the Fellowship resources tend to be precious, and I would much rather have that to exhaust the One Ring than to try and keep Gildor around every turn. So honestly, I'm not that impressed with either. If you put a gun to my head and I had to choose, I think I would go with Mr. Underhill just because I'm not so sure I'd want to invest those resources into keeping Gildor around for any length of time.
I think I'm inclined to agree with you. Even though I like the fact that Gildor is free, I don't like that you're gonna have to wait until you dig through your deck to put him into play. There's not really a great way to gauge whether or not that willpower or attack strength is going to make all the difference for you. It seems kind of messy that he changes control based on who the first player is. And just like you mentioned, I don't like that he drains your Fellowship resources. Certainly something that makes Mr. Underhill more appealing is that it begins the game attached to the Ring Bearer. It just seems pretty difficult at this point, knowing that we have 15 more scenarios coming out, which of these boons it is we want to pick. So just like being uncertain as to what heroes we'd want to try and traipse through campaign mode with, it's pretty difficult to settle on a boon. So I like being able to prevent an enemy from attacking. Even though Gildor is a fantastic blocker, he's likely to end up surviving a defense. It's also possible you might get some sort of nasty shadow effect that kills him, or something that harms you whether he lives or dies. So certainly I like the outright prevention of an attack. I suppose at this point it's a little bit of a toss-up between these two, so since neither Matthew or myself have yet to take the plunge into campaign mode, be sure to let us know in the comments which of these two have you settled on after beating the very first scenario of our Lord of the Rings saga. But once you've gotten past our first quest, as soon as you beat our second scenario, A Knife in the Dark, the players are presented with yet another option. This time they have to choose between 4 different boon attachments and permanently affix one of these neutral player cards to a hero they control. Each of these 4 unique attachments has a cost of 0, they're permanent, and during the setup portion of the game, you have to always attach them to the same hero. So if at some point that hero is ever killed, you lose the benefit of these attachments forever. And the attachments are Noble Hero, which gives attached hero +1 willpower and the Noble trait, Skilled Healer, which gives attached hero +2 hit points and the Healer trait, Tireless Ranger, which gives +1 defense and the Ranger trait, and Valiant Warrior, which gives +1 attack strength and the Warrior trait. So, again, given an option between these 4 different boons, which one is most appealing to you, Matthew?
So this decision for me is a lot easier than between Mr. Underhill or Gildor, in part because the traits don't mean a whole lot yet. For Noble, certainly the Palantir could work, or I think the more common use of Noble is the Envoy of Pelargir. Healer doesn't really have much. Ranger has a little bit with Ranger Bow in some of those locations like Overgrown Trail. But I think because there aren't a whole lot of cheap ways to universally boost hit points, I would go with Skilled Healer. Because in campaign mode, having heroes die is a traumatic event. Getting my heroes, whether it's Hobbit heroes or whomever, 2 extra hit points to me is quite worthwhile.
There certainly is quite the discrepancy between the development of these very disparate traits. We saw in a spoiler article that we're finally going to see some benefit to the Warrior trait in allowing characters with the Warrior trait to equip certain boons that are going to be coming out a little bit further down the line. But apart from that, there's pretty limited utility with all of these cards. You happen to mention that overgrown trail location, but we certainly don't see anything like that in the Black Riders, and there's absolutely no use at this point for the healer traits. But as much as I was convinced you were going to go for the attack strength bolstering effect, I'll have to agree. I think the +2 hit points is so important, because if you do happen to lose a hero, it's gone for good. If you're running the likes of Gimli or Glowin, that really feeds into that synergy. None of these attachments take up a restricted slot, and I'm sure at some point we're bound to see a benefit to that healer trait. So I've never much cared for Forest Patrol. I myself haven't really tried out Ranger Bow, but I don't think that's quite enough to warrant wanting to put the Ranger trait onto a character. So certainly there's nothing wrong with giving a defending character additional points of defense, but there's certainly opportunities for characters to take direct damage, and even though 1 defense might spare you more damage in the long term than a bigger pool of hit points, I can't help but feel like that'll keep me a little bit further from harm's way, and willpower and attack strength certainly we come across in spades.
Right, that was exactly the reason I chose Skilled Healer. Boosting defense, willpower, and attack, there's plenty of options, whether it's events or attachments that do that. And again, hit points, much harder to come by. Citadel Plate is universal, but most of the other boosts are limited to certain races, whether it's dwarves or hobbits.
Well, now that we've covered all of our new heroes, all of our new player cards, and the 6 Boon cards unique to the Black Riders Saga Expansion, what are your overall thoughts, Matthew, about all of these cards?
You've mentioned a few times that the speculation about the hobbits was rampant before this came out, because they weren't really a developed trait prior to this. And I think you're right, they've ended up being a powerhouse. And I think in many ways they kind of had to be, because we sort of knew hobbits wouldn't have very many hit points, their stats are going to be low. They'd have to make up for that in some other way, because they can't really tangle with a whole lot of enemies, they're not questing for much, and so they needed some way to compensate. And boy did they ever do so. So I've said in multiple places that this is by far my favorite expansion, not only because of the player cards, but also because of the quests. So I'm certainly excited to get to those in our Progression Series playthroughs, but I think the cards are great. I could pretty much say I like every card. I mean, certainly in our comments there were a few we were less keen on, but really it's a matter of degree, because so many of the cards are so good, so so versatile, it really just is a top-notch expansion. So I don't even know if I could pick a favorite card. I think if I had to, Elfstone's up there, Dagger of Western Knees, and if I had to pick a favorite hero, it's probably Sam Gamgee, though lore version of Pippin would be a very, very close second. So just a solid expansion. Kudos to Caleb and Matt for the design of this one. It's just great. I can't say enough good things about it.
I have to wholeheartedly agree. So, as much as I enjoyed the dwarves, I enjoy the effects of these Hobbit cards even more. So, whereas the dwarves themselves were certainly powerful, it seemed as though that synergy was kinda limited to run a bunch of dwarf characters and play Dane Ironfoot, so they all get +1 willpower and +1 attack. So, certainly powerful in its own rights, but it didn't really have the mechanics of those cards working with one another to the degree that we see in the Hobbit trait. So I find all of these cards interesting, even the ones I'm hesitant to include in a deck at this point, just because I feel like they all have some use. They all have a potential, even if it's not quite yet realized. So all of these heroes, again, with one exception, I really enjoy. I'm very much torn between Mary and Sam for picking a favorite. I think it's very funny that Sam actually brings more willpower to the table than Frodo does, but I'm just blown away by the power of these cards, by how fun the mechanics are, and just by how tightly interwoven the synergy is. I certainly wasn't expecting much, so I can freely say this set was certainly beyond my wildest expectations, so Since I've been gone for this game for so long, I've yet to actually play any of the Black Riders scenarios, so I'm very excited to give them a spin, and like I mentioned earlier, I cannot wait to try out a Hobbit deck. But I believe that finally brings this video to a close, so as always, thank you guys so much for checking out yet another installment of the LOTR LCG Progression Series. Be sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed what you saw, subscribe to our channel if you have not done so already. We're in the process of building a brand new community on Facebook, so feel free to check out facebook.com/10th Nazgul Show to get all the information about upcoming videos, new projects, and all sorts of exciting stuff like that. Be sure to leave a comment below if we undervalued or overvalued a card in your opinion. If you can think of any clever uses that escaped Matthew and I for any of these player cards, we're always happy to read what you guys have to say. So, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.